Do you enjoy creepy horror stories? Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street.
121 Ash Street by John Gallant. Certain houses, like certain persons, manage somehow to proclaim at once their character for evil. Algernon Blackwood. I believe in ghosts now. Finally, so does David, to his everlasting horror. Until the end, David was the true skeptic. Nothing frightened him. No ghostly moaning or bumps in the night could shake his faith in pure science, or his absolute belief that life exists on this plane only. He marched boldly into the darkest recesses of the most sinister buildings, ignored the direst warnings of otherworldly danger, and one by one debunked all the boogeyman stories and tales of restless spirits that were brought before us. David was fearless. Not me. In the hours of detailed planning and preparation for our ghost hunting, it was easy to play the rational man, an apostle of cold fact and logic. But when we stepped over the thresholds of those haunted houses, when the blind dark enveloped us after the cameras and motion detectors were set and the flashlights extinguished, fear and doubt took root and spread their tendrils through my gut. On more than a few occasions, when we were confronted by the apparent presence of something truly supernatural, I would have fled if David's calm manner and his vice-like grip on reality hadn't held me in check. A simple, "Steady, John," from his lips was enough to anchor me back in this world when it appeared that we were on the brink of another. He would have marched into the mouth of hell to prove the devil was a straw man. And it all began as a lark, really. Over drinks one evening at the Iron Cross, our local watering hole, the bartender recounted the story of the Cross's own ghost, a spectral Hessian purportedly murdered at the inn during the Revolutionary War. At night, guests would hear the Hessian's heavy boots treading the floor in the room where he was murdered. Ceaselessly, the barkeep related with dramatic flair. The Hessian marched back and forth in his restless pattern. It made for great listening over a couple of Johnny Walker blues before the fireplace. As he spoke, a delightful thrill ran up my spine. I've always loved a spook story. When the bartender finished, I was about to ask him more about the murdered soldier when David loudly interjected. "Hooey," he said. The bartender and I turned to look at him. "Oh, it's nonsense, and you both know it," he grinned. "In fact, if you'll let us," his gesture included me, "stay in the Hessian's bedroom, we'll prove it's hooey." Suffice to say, I wasn't thrilled to be a part of the bargain. I made some excuses about my work and the demands on my time, but David would have none of it. "It'll be great fun, John," he said with that damnable grin. "We'll have this malarkey sorted out in no time, and that blowhard of a manager will have to figure out some other way to get these silly tourists into the Cross." The manager of the Iron Cross was a bit of a blowhard, but sensing some great publicity prospects with the local scribes, he ceremoniously arranged for us to spend the night in room 311, a room that the inn never rented to guests, all part of the marketing behind the ghost, you know. We brought candles, cameras, flashlights, some tools, the rudimentary items that we, as newcomers to the occult game, thought ghost hunters ought to have. We shut ourselves in, and as daylight waned early on winter's day, we sat in the encroaching darkness and waited for our otherworldly visitor to show itself. It was anticlimactic, as most of the cases would turn out to be over the years. David was able to sort it all out in short order. Bad plumbing and overwrought imaginations. But I'll confess that as we sat cross-legged in the dark, the first bangings of that pipe unnerved me more than a little. It really sounded as though heavy hobnailed boots were crossing the room in the darkness. Had I been alone? Well, let's just say I'm not sure I would have held my ground. The manager got his publicity, though it certainly wasn't what he'd hoped for, and it has likely cost him a great deal of money in the years since. For me, the outing was a great story to dine out on, an experience, if you will. But it sparked a passion in David, and he swept me along with him despite my initial protests. In the years afterward, we investigated many more houses, as well as theaters, warehouses, schools, cemeteries, churches, a gymnasium, even an automobile that were said to be haunted. Our equipment grew to include infrared sensors, night vision goggles, motion-detecting cameras, and other tools designed to capture hard evidence of the supernatural, or rather, the lack thereof. In every case, yes, sometimes I figured it out, were able to find a rational, natural cause for the occult manifestations. Sometimes the answers came easily. Sometimes we found outright hoaxes. But no matter how dark and dreary the building, no matter how frightening the noises or lights or visions, we always triumphed in the end. We left the homeowner or the landlord with an explanation, and often a simple method for exorcising his ghost, some well-placed nails, better weather stripping, or an exterminator. I'd like to tell you that our customers were pleased with our work, but in many cases they were clearly disappointed with the loss of their spirits, or banshees, or poltergeists. More meal tickets destroyed. Great stories no longer to be told around the fireplace. Over time we gained some small fame for our adventure, and I rather enjoyed the interviews and the obligatory TV news stories leading up to Halloween. A pair of local ghost hunters is hoping to come face to face with a real Casper tonight, the pieces invariably began. We'd become local celebrities. That was plenty for me, but David wanted more. He strove to prove that the supernatural was, well, hooey. He spoke with deep disgust about society's growing fascination with witches and angels, demonic possession, and so-called psychics who could speak to the dead. He sought out tougher and tougher cases. He challenged people to deliver us into a true haunted house. He even posted a large reward payable to anyone who presented an unsolvable case, a genuine paranormal occurrence. There were many takers, but no one claimed the prize. It was with great enthusiasm, then, that he met me one autumn morning to tell me about our next adventure. "John, this case is ideal for us," he said with a broad grin. He laid a set of photographs before me. The building looked nondescript, then a pretty townhouse in the heart of the city. It wasn't known by some fear-inspiring name like Hill House or Starking Manor or some such, but its address and its image are seared into my memory now. The house is the central landscape of my nightmares. 121 Ash Street, near Governor's Circle, David reported. It's about 125 years old, and the current owners, a rather wealthy family, have had the luxury of keeping it unoccupied for nearly 30 years now. They won't lease it because its reputation is so bad. He was practically giddy. "This one has really caught your fancy, David, but I have to say that it looks plain enough. What's the gruesome story that goes along with 121 Ash?" "Oh, some nonsense about a previous owner. The usual gothic stuff. They say he discovered his wife was cheating on him and chased her through the house with murder in his eyes," he said, smirking. "She fell over the railing on the upstairs landing, and he dived after her in his mad bloodlust. The servants found them twisted and dead in a pool of blood in the foyer." He turned and took a sip of his coffee. I waited. "Well," I said, "what else?" "Oh," he replied coolly, "anyone who's tried to live there has heard them racing through the house, with her screaming. Some have seen his mad face as he roars past, and I'm told it's enough to frighten one out of one's very wits. One is said to feel haunted in the house, as though the mad master of the place will chase you down next. As I said, pretty standard stuff." "Lovely," I added, with some distaste. "Tell me, Why are you so blessedly enthusiastic about this one?" David leaned over the table conspiratorially. "Among the ectoplasm set, it's a real winner. It's so bad they won't even talk about it publicly. They want to prevent people from going in there. They've had the big guns in, and the scuttlebutt is that they were shaken up pretty good. Remember that phony psychic from New York, that Myrna Caldwell we encountered in Woodland? She went out on a stretcher, passed out. Rumor is she's out of the racket." He could barely contain his smirk. I got a sinking feeling. "Sounds pretty bad." He laughed. "Bad? It's wonderful. My gut tells me they're working this one up to be the next Amityville Horror. Run the so-called experts through, get a book out of it, then sell the movie rights for a couple million. Great scam. I'm sure they're all cut in for a slice from the owners. But if that's the plan, they'll never let us in there. We'd scotch the whole deal." He smiled broadly. "That's the beautiful part. Turns out the company that manages the property is owned by an old college buddy of mine. I ran into him at a reunion last weekend, and I talked him into letting us in. He was none too thrilled with the idea, and he's likely to change his mind at any moment, so we must hurry." A flutter of fear passed through me, and I was at a loss for a response. It sounds cliched to say it now, but I had a bad feeling from that very moment. David became a bit somber himself, stirring his coffee and staring into the swirling mocha whirlpool he'd created. "It was rather disappointing, really, to talk to him about the place. I remember him being quite level-headed, but it seems he really believes the stories. He's genuinely scared of the house, honestly frightened." He shook his head and sighed. "Well, at least he's not in cahoots with the others. He wishes they'd never gotten involved with the place, and he'd like nothing better than to clear up the problem and be able to rent the damn thing." David sipped his coffee. Mine remained untouched. David was traveling that week, so I agreed to stop by the office of his college chum and get the keys to 121 Ash, luxury building in a very trendy part of the city. On the walls of the plush lobby were framed photographs of the properties, all top-tier homes and condos, managed by the Peterson Company. 121 Ash was not among them. Randall Peterson shook my hand rather limply and escorted me to his office, which looked out over the city's financial district. As we sat down on opposite sides of his massive oak desk, I noticed a small keyring holding a couple of keys atop an envelope. "You and David have had some fun for yourselves with this ghost hunting business," he said flatly. A statement of fact, or was there some implied question or criticism? "I have enjoyed working with him in our explorations," I replied, not taking any bait that might have been offered. "David believes that he's doing something important." Peterson looked down at the keys and then up at me. "I wonder if you could talk him out of this particular exploration, as you call it." "And why would I do that?" Simply put, Randall Peterson made me uncomfortable. "I've known David for many years. He's done a great deal for me, and I feel I should assist him in any way I'm able." He paused and looked me in the eyes. "But I also know that he is relentless, even when it is not in his best interests to pursue a particular matter. He shouldn't pursue this matter, but frankly, I don't believe I could dissuade him." He pushed the keys back and forth with his fingertips, carefully weighing his words. "But you, Mr. Dmitri, perhaps I can dissuade you. Then you could dissuade David." I was uncomfortable with the gravity of his tone, and I tried to lighten the discussion. "You speak as though the house were really haunted, Mr. Peterson." "It is," he replied, staring straight into my eyes. "It is haunted, beyond all doubt. Of that I can assure you." "Really, Mr. Peterson, surely you don't believe that, and you don't expect me to believe it either." "I most certainly do, and you most certainly will if you choose to go there. But that would be unwise of you. He paused, perhaps for effect. "And David." I fidgeted in my chair, not quite knowing where to go next. "So, you've seen this ghost? This mad murderer who chases his victim for eternity?" "No, I haven't." "Then how do you know the house is haunted? How do you know these stories aren't just that, stories?" Peterson looked me over carefully as though deciding whether I was competent to discuss the matter. "I've been there, Mr. Dimitri, and I've felt the presence of something very powerful. Mr. Peterson, surely you know how that sounds. Anyone who's heard one of these haunted house stories is certainly going to feel strange and apprehensive when visiting the place in question. It's how the mystique builds up. It's part of the whole aura." I was acting the part of the rational man, though I felt increasingly uneasy in the role. He didn't flinch. "I know exactly how it must sound, and I don't care a whit. I've felt what others, the people who've lived there and worked there, have felt. Thank God I haven't seen what they've seen. Our very first tenant died there. He fell from the second-story landing." Peters paused, perhaps for effect. "The last tenant who lived there in 1985 is institutionalized to this day. 2 of my best employees left the company after I sent them to 121 Ash to get to the root of the problem. They refuse to even take my calls to this day." "Well," I said with false bravado, "David and I will determine what is happening there. We'll find that your ghost can be explained away. In the end, you'll have a perfectly good property to rent." Peterson paused for a moment and turned to look out over the city. "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy." He spoke with his back to me. His remark piqued me. I'm always better in a confrontation when I get miffed. "Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 5. I'm familiar with the line, but to date, Mr. Peterson, we have yet to find anything, on Earth at least, that is not in our philosophy." He turned to look at me once more, his face softening. "I meant no offense. Genuinely. A friend of David's is a friend of mine." He looked down at the keys once more as though he loathed them. "But I think you'll be getting into something with which you have no real experience, Mr. Dimitri. 121 Ash Street isn't some abandoned wreck with banging shutters and the wind whistling through the eaves. It's a solid, beautifully crafted home, and it is, without a doubt, haunted. Most thoroughly haunted." I stood up. "Really, Mr. Peterson, I don't know what else to say. You know David would not be talked out of this, so why don't you let us get on with it? With luck," I said with a smile, "you'll soon have this beautifully crafted home featured in one of your lobby photos." He didn't stand. "With luck, Mr. Dimitri, you'll come out of this exploration unharmed, or perhaps it would be better to say unchanged." We stood, not speaking for a moment, before I finally said, "May I have the keys, Mr. Peterson?" He glanced down at them. "You may take them. I won't be responsible for giving them to you." You could not imagine a day less suited for ghost hunting. On this late Saturday afternoon, the sun shone down with vigor, and the city was alive with people traveling this way and that on myriad errands and amusements. And as we turned down Ash Street, you could not imagine a less likely setting for a haunted house. The homes were stately and beautifully landscaped, and an air of prosperity suffused the entire neighborhood. Even the small fence-bounded lawn of 121 Ash was neatly manicured. The Peterson Company was upholding at least a part of its bargain as the property manager. Normally, David and I would arrive at our chosen location shortly after sunset, but he wanted to get to 121 Ash earlier because, inexplicably, we had not been able to contact Ed Sawyer. Ed, a gruff bear of a man with a lion's heart, was responsible for setting up our ghost hunting gear in advance of our explorations. He was deeply loyal to David. My sense is that my companion had done something extraordinary for Ed in the past, though neither man would ever discuss it. Ed and his team would scout locations for us, looking for any trap doors, hidden passageways, or other oddities, and then arrange our cameras, motion detectors, and the like. On more than one occasion, Ed and his team, the Hardy Boys, he called them, had solved the mysteries before we even arrived, finding the cause of the so-called haunting through their advance work. But Ed, who had led his Hardy Boys to 121 Ash early this morning, was not to be found. We tried him at his apartment and on his mobile phone, but had gotten no response. We'd rung several of the Hardys, but they were unreachable as well. David guessed that Ed and the gang had finished quickly, slipped off to the track to see the ponies, and forgotten to call to tell us the site was ready, something he always did. So we aimed for an early arrival in case something had prevented Ed from completing his work, and we needed to finish the prep. As David lifted the latch to the white picket fence in front of the house, birds sang in the small tree overhanging the sidewalk. The house was in good condition and looked as if it had been painted in the past year. The only detail out of place in the whole warm scene was the windows, which were blocked off by blinds on the inside. Still, a heart-sick feeling descended on me as I headed up the walk. I could not shake the growing conviction that we were walking into a trap. Perhaps David felt the same way. At the bottom of the steps leading up to the small porch, he stopped and looked the house over from top to bottom. "Funny," he said, without looking at me. "It looks so normal, for lack of a better word. It's difficult to believe this house has caused such a ruckus." He stood with his hands on his hips, observing for a moment longer, and then said with what seemed a hint of regret, "Well, I suppose we should get in there." As I reached to put the key in the lock, we noticed simultaneously that the door was ever so slightly ajar. "That's odd," I said. "Not like Ed to leave the site this way. I hope no one's gotten in after they left." David reached out and pushed the door gently. It swung open to reveal a beautifully designed foyer with a gently curved staircase leading to the second-floor landing. A smaller landing, protected by an ornate wooden railing, towered above on the third floor. There were sumptuous black and white marble tiles on the floor of the foyer, along with a large jumbled pile of our equipment. "That's damned strange," David said as he stepped into the house. I took one last look back at the sun-dappled neighborhood and joined him, shutting the door behind me and locking us in. David walked over to the gear, which looked as though it had been dropped in haste. I looked up the staircase and into the rooms off the foyer. I noticed a couple of other pieces of equipment in the nearby rooms, as though Ed and the Hardy Boys had begun to make their way around the house before deciding to exit in a hurry. It was cool inside, but even in my heightened state of apprehension, I knew that was simply because of the blinds on the windows. It was not preternaturally cold, no chilling atmosphere of gloom. Still, I felt increasingly uneasy, not the least so because of the unexplained pile of equipment before us. "Hello? Ed, are you here? Ed!" David had tilted his head back to holler up the stairs, and I'll confess that I jumped like a nervous schoolgirl. "Damn it, David! Give some warning before you bellow out like that, will you?" He looked at me and let out a hearty laugh. "Oh, John, I'm sorry to startle you. You look like you've already seen our ghost." He laughed again, the last time I would ever hear him laugh, and the sound was quickly soaked up in the emptiness of 121 Ash. Ed and the boys were not to be found, nor was there a note or anything else to indicate why they had left us in such a spot. We decided that we'd walk the house ourselves to make sure we were alone and to find anything out of the ordinary. We split up, with David taking the first floor and I the second. He moved into the large living room to the right of the foyer, and I headed toward the stairs. Have you ever known that you were going to become ill before you came down with something? Before you exhibit any symptoms at all? Before the first sneeze or cough, you begin to feel a change coming over you, an odd tingling at the back of your throat, or queerness of the nerves, a sense that you're not right. As I put my foot on that first step, I experienced something similar, yet profoundly different. Not physical, but psychological. I began to sense a queerness of spirit. I don't know how else to describe it. I felt in my soul, perhaps, that something was profoundly wrong and deeply dangerous. With each plodding, unwilling tread up that long staircase, that primitive warning feeling, now awakened, grew. And then I understood why. I knew, without seeing or hearing anything, that someone or something was slowly moving down the staircase toward me. I knew this the same way the blind man knows that he is not alone as he stands on the corner waiting to cross the street. Instinctively, I inched to the left to give this thing more room to pass by me. I sensed that it was aping my pace and that we would pass one another near the middle of the stairway. As I approached that spot, my knees felt as though they would give way. I stopped and, cringing, leaned into the wall, averting my gaze, afraid of looking at what? A spasm of terror passed through me, and I knew that whatever else shared that staircase had stopped opposite and was coldly, evilly contemplating me. I thought to cry out to David, but I could not muster a voice. I tried to fight my fear, to reach out a hand and touch whatever stood next to me, to prove there was nothing at all, and that my imagination was getting the better of me. But I could not. I could not even look up for fear that I would make some connection with this invisible other and incur the hatred and anger I could sense that it seethed with. For a few moments that seemed unending. I quivered in its presence on the staircase, and then slowly, steadily, the grip was released, and I knew that whatever it was I had encountered had turned from me and was continuing down the staircase. "David?" I called out weakly, barely audible. I cleared my throat and shouted in a squeaky voice, "David, come here!" I heard him walking back through the living room, and as he moved into the foyer to the foot of the steps, he turned to look behind himself as though someone had passed him by. "Did you feel something?" I asked, still a bit breathless. He looked at me queerly. "Are you all right, John? You look like you might collapse where you stand." I realized I was still leaning against the wall, and I straightened up, my knees still shaky. "I've had a good scare, I don't mind saying, David. Something was on this staircase with me, and I think it just moved past you." David looked at me skeptically. "You saw something? You heard something?" It wasn't the first time David had treated me like a frightened child who needed a glass of warm milk. I'd been jumpy on many an occasion, and David's steady and lightly patronizing manner had calmed me. We'd even had some good chuckles about my behavior over drinks. But just then, for the first time, my anger flared. "Don't give me that damn smug look. There was something here. I'm telling you that something moved past me on the stairs." I could feel my face redden, and I noticed my fists had clenched. "You felt it yourself. I saw you turn. Something passed by you in the foyer." David's demeanor changed completely. A look of genuine concern mixed with confusion came over his face. "John, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. What did you feel?" The anger drained from me, leaving me even weaker. I sat down on the step and rubbed my temples. "I don't know how to describe it, David, but I've never had such a feeling of being watched, of being in the presence of something foreign and malignant." I looked down at him. "Didn't you feel something just now after I called you?" "Yes. I felt a breeze, a draft. It's not unusual in a big empty house." "Are you sure that's all it was? You didn't feel anything odd, Unnerving? He shook his head. No, John, just a draft. I started to respond, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of every door in 121 Ash slamming shut at once. What the hell was that? I blurted out, but David was already moving. I ran down the stairs and followed him into the living room. He stood before the tall sliding doors that separated the living room from a small drawing room beyond. These doors were wide open a moment ago, David said, looking them up and down. Someone is in this house, he said, then grabbed the two doors and flung them open. He ran into the drawing room where there was a single door that was also closed. He raced to open it and ran into the kitchen. I hurried after, not wanting to be left behind. David, how could someone have closed all these doors at once? I was out of breath, only partially from our quick pace. David, who was examining a kitchen door leading to the backyard, did not answer. This is bolted from the inside, he said. They didn't get in here. As he said it, we heard the doors opening throughout the house. We turned to see the pantry door and a heavy oak door across the kitchen open simultaneously of their own accord. For a second, like an image captured in a flash of lightning, I saw the first inkling of confusion or fear, at least the first I had ever seen, cross David's face. He was silent and turned to look from one door to another several times. It's odd, but I remember thinking of the sunlight at that moment. The last rays of a glorious sunset were still trying to penetrate the blinds. It was warm and delightful outside, but my heart and blood were chilled. David rallied from his brief setback, ran across the kitchen and out through the just-opened doorway. The suddenness of his movement startled me, and I hustled to follow him, but he yelled over his shoulder, "Check the pantry, John!" I stopped and approached the pantry slowly. I dreaded to enter the enclosed space, which was far darker than the kitchen. The power was shut off to the house, so I would have to use the small flashlight I kept on my belt. I moved to the pantry doorway and shined the light inside. Nothing but empty shelves. Keeping one foot squarely lodged against the base of the door to ensure it would not slam shut in my face, I craned around to look behind it. Nothing. I turned to yell to David, but he was standing right behind me, startling me once again. "Jesus, David!" He peered around me. "It's empty," I snapped. "No one in the dining room either," he said. His face was flush. "John, we have to split up and quickly check all the rooms. You take the upstairs, I'll check everything on this level and the basement." He turned to head out through the dining room, and I began to walk in the opposite direction, heading back toward the foyer. But with each step, an increasingly powerful, almost physical sense of danger began to grow in me. I knew that whatever I had sensed on the stairs was near, and it was gloating. I knew that this presence wanted us apart, that it was enjoying our confusion and consuming our crackling emotions. As I moved into the drawing room, the feeling became almost overwhelming. I turned and cried out, "David! Wait! Come back here!" As soon as I did, the feeling disappeared, like a light going out. I felt as the impala must feel when the lion turns away its withering gaze and moves on. David trotted back. "What is it, John? What's wrong?" How could I explain it to him? To the most pragmatic man in the world, someone who put little stock in feelings. "David, listen to me now and trust what I'm telling you." He looked at me quizzically, impatiently, then started to interject. But I put my hand up to stop him. "No, you must listen to me. There is something in this house, and it's malevolent. I've known it since I started walking up those stairs. It's distracting us with the doors, and it wants to separate us. For what reason, God only knows, but we must stay together. You must listen to me about this." I was breathless, shaking. I'm sure I looked the perfect fool. I waited for David to launch into me for my cowardice, but he was clearly confused. He had never seen me so earnest. Finally, David opened his mouth to speak, but but before he uttered a single word, the sound of heavy footsteps began to pound above our heads. We heard the solid tread cross the floor and race off. We could hear the footsteps echoing as whatever caused them ran past the second-floor landing. The noise paralyzed me, but it spurred David to action. "It's time we stopped this nonsense and got hold of this interloper. I'll run after him and flush him down the back stairway, over there." He pointed to a narrow doorway and a dark flight of stairs that led up from the kitchen to what were once servants' rooms, most likely. "Wait here." He turned to leave, and I snapped out of my fear-induced stupor. "No, David! Don't go! We have to leave this house at once." I grabbed hold of his sleeve, but he yanked it away with a look of disgust and darted off. "Stay here, John. You'll see our ghost very soon." With a look of relish, he was gone. I heard his footsteps, louder at first than the other steps, which continued to pound throughout the house. I could sense the first runner moving higher up into the house, the sound of steps on stairs, and then a more distant echoing. David was now on the second floor, and as he ran, he shouted out to me, breathless, "Steady, John! I'll drive him down to you in no time." It was at that moment I noticed that I could hear only one set of footsteps, David's. He pounded up the staircase to the third floor, his tread getting lighter as he rose. Then, for what seemed like an eternity, there was nothing. In the silence of 121 Ash, I could make out the twittering of birds outside, an incongruous sound. I began to look around me for a weapon, to confront whoever was in the house, when a scream, David's high-pitched, frantic scream, tore the air. The scream was followed by the harsh, chaotic sounds of desperate combat, David grunting and gasping, and then yelling, "No! No!" before finally a long wail culminated in a staggering thud that shook the house. I was immobilized by fear. I hoarsely shouted, "David! David!" But my voice carried a little way beyond the kitchen. I tried to summon my body, to move, to get to David, who surely needed my aid. But I was frozen until I heard the footsteps again. 2 sets, one running after the other, and they were coming down toward me. I heard the pounding getting closer and closer, and finally from the doorway at the bottom of the stairs, David came flying out, a look of mortal terror on his face. He raced to me and grabbed me roughly, shouting, "No!" Instinctively, I swung him around behind me to protect him. As I did, the second set of steps pounded to the bottom of the stairs, and as I stared in dread at the doorway, the footsteps hit the kitchen floor and stopped. I knew whatever I had encountered in the foyer at the outset of our exploration was with me again. A wave of black enmity passed over me, and I felt heartsick. David cringed behind me, cowering at my back. "No," he whimpered. Strangely enough, I believe that saved me. I knew that, for once, I was stronger and that David needed me. Mustering what little authority I could, I spoke to this other thing that waited before me. "Get away from us, goddamn you!" I said in a voice husky with fear. "We'll leave now!" We endured a long pause under the invisible, baleful gaze, and then I heard, or rather felt at my core, an evil chuckle, a laugh of pure hatred that still resonates in my memory. And then it moved on. No footsteps, no sound, but I knew we were alone again. David collapsed to the floor, softly sobbing, and I knelt beside him. This once fearless man had been reduced to a near incoherent state of terror. I pulled him to his knees and turned his head to face me. "What happened, David? My God, what happened?" He shook his head and began to babble. Him. I saw him and her. He killed her, chased her. So beautiful. She fell. Oh, God. Seeing him like this frightened me to my soul, but I knew we had only a little time left. The sun had very nearly faded, and it was imperative that we leave 121 Ash at once. I could not imagine being in the house after dark. I forced David to rise, and we began to head toward the front of the house, moving through the drawing room toward the foyer. But as we approached the foyer, which had grown much darker and populated with more shadows, David began to sob and pull away. "For God's sakes, David, we have to leave now," I yelled as I pulled him toward the foyer. He gibbered and cowered. "No, no," he moaned. "I can't go. I can't look. I can't bear to." "You must go. We must go, David, now." I succeeded in hauling him to the foyer, where I caught sight of a dark shape on the marbled floor. At first I thought it was our equipment, until I recognized the outline of a body. "Sweet Jesus," I whispered as I leaned closer to examine the form. "David, what is this?" But he would not look. He huddled at the doorway to the drawing room and mumbled fearfully. I inched closer, and in the dying sunlight that eked through the narrow windows beside the front door, I stared down at the corpse, for it was clearly a corpse. The body was sprawled flat on its chest, but its head was twisted back, the neck broken, and the face that stared up at me, wide-eyed with terror and with a narrow trail of blood leaking from one corner of the mouth, was David's. My mind reeled. "David?" I stammered as I turned to look back at my friend, my long partner in adventure. David now stood bolt upright, staring past me, past the corpse, to the other side of the foyer. "No," he croaked hoarsely. "No." As I turned to look, I heard that low, evil laugh once again. It issued from a dark, bearded face, emerging from a shadowy doorway. A man, what had once been a man, stepped into the foyer and paused to look at me, then to gaze at the corpse at my feet. A hideous sneer passed over his face, and then he turned to David and laughed that guttural chuckle once again. David screamed and began to run up the long stairway. The man looked triumphantly at me and then ran after David, laughing. And as I watched in primal horror, their shapes faded and finally disappeared. For some moments I could hear the footsteps racing through the house, but they quickly faded away. I was left alone, in silence, trembling like a newborn deer. I would like to tell you that I carried David's body out of that place, that I honored my companion by protecting his earthly remains. But I did not. I ran out the doorway, down the walk, back into the normal world where couples strolled down the sidewalk in the warm evening and cars rolled by me. I made my way to a small restaurant in the neighborhood and finally called the police. While I waited, I downed several shots of brandy and savored the harsh burn as it poured down my parched throat. I lied to the police. I told them David had leaned over the third-floor railing to get a better look at the foyer, and he had fallen. I lied to protect David's reputation. I lied because I simply could not explain what had happened in any way the police would understand. I lied because I could not deal with the truth. I told them I could not return to 121 Ash. That much is true, anyway. They did not force me to go back with them. There was a brief investigation. The police didn't seem to want to spend any more time in the house than was absolutely necessary. I don't know if they heard or saw anything unusual while they were at 121 Ash. I don't care to know. 121 Ash Street remains shuttered to this day, but it is not unoccupied.
Are you looking for more creepy horror stories? Click the link in the description or search Scare Street on Audible for a list of all our bone-chilling titles. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street. See you in the shadows.